Alright guys, welcome back to the Tech Savvy YouTube channel. This video is part 2 of our How to Build a Computer series. If you want to watch part 1 to see where we started off with the core components, check the link in the description below. This video will be covering taking the core components from our first video and installing them inside a computer case. We will be discussing cable management and how to keep your computer build clean and free of obstructions. We will also be covering all the different pins that will be connecting to the front ports on your computer's case, such as USB ports, power button, hard drive light, power light, and we will also be covering miscellaneous tips and tricks to help your build go along smoothly. All right, let's get started. Of course, we're going to be bringing our core components back. Now, just to recap, we mounted the processor and heatsink and fan combination. We installed our RAM, installed our NVMe solid-state drive all onto our motherboard. We powered on the unit, went into the BIOS, set the memory speed, and now this unit is ready to go inside the computer case. Once all these components are installed, we're going to power it on, go back into the UEFI, cover a couple more steps, and then in our follow-up video, we will be installing the Windows 10 operating system, testing for stability, and then your computer will be ready to go. Now for the star of today's video. I know this doesn't fit in frame, but I just wanted to show you that the case is the largest part of your computer build. And of course, it's where all the components will reside. It's where airflow is maintained. I'll be taking this out of the box now and showing you the inside. All right, I'm keeping this case right side up only for a moment. The first step is we're going to remove both of these side panels. We're going to start by taking off these back screws. Now I apologize if you guys couldn't see that, but I took out these screws here and here in order to loosen the panels. Now I'm just going to put some pressure on the side. Now in the first video I talked about the screws that come standard with your case. That's usually included in a bag like this. We're going to put those off to the side for now. These are the cables that will be connecting to your front panel pins. We have USB 3.0, USB 2.0, power reset hard drive, and power light, and our front panel audio connector. We're going to put those right off to the side for the time being. This case comes with a 120mm fan using the 3-pin fan connector, which is fully compatible with the 4-pin connectors located on the motherboard. Now we're going to get started by installing the power supply first. It gets installed into this cutout located on the bottom of the case, and in pretty much all standard cases, there's a cutout at the bottom where the power supply fan will be facing. This is so the power supply could pull in fresh, cool air from outside of the case and not pull in the warm air from inside the case coming from the other computer components. If you are using an old case, then there is a chance that there is no power supply cutout, and in that case, you want to make sure the fan is not facing towards the outside of the case because it will end up being starved of fresh air. I lined up the power supply for the cutout in the back. I'm going to get 4 of these screws that we're going to use to mount the power supply in the case. I'm going to use one to hold it in position so I could show you guys how to install the rest of them. Now, installing the power supply with all of its weight facing downwards isn't the recommended way to do it, but it's the easiest way to show you guys. These screws go in very easily. I'm just going to give it a couple of turns first, and then I'm going to tighten it up. Now, our other two screw holes are located right here. If they don't line up the first time, then you may just want to loosen your other two screws and move everything into position. All right, our power supply is completely installed, but before we move on, I want to talk about these holes right here. These holes are if the power supply were rotated the other way around and the fan were facing upwards, this screw would go here, this screw would go there. It's just to let you know that these cases are designed to have the power supply facing either way. It is always recommended to have the power supply getting fresh air from outside of the case, if it's available, of course. We're going to take our I/O shield and install it in the cutout in the back of the case, located right here. A quick way to know which direction your I/O shield is supposed to be facing is just look for the labels. The labels are supposed to be on the outside of the case. This way you know which direction to install it in. If you notice some of these little tabs located here, you might want to lift them out of the way, because every now and again when you install the motherboard into here, the tab might actually go into the port instead of above it. That's just a little tip to keep an eye out for whenever you're installing motherboards. I'm going to line up the shield with the rectangular hole. I'm going to put my fingers on both sides and I'm going to push in at the corners. And now our I/O shield is completely installed. If you're worried about the I/O shield being loose when you install it, don't worry about it. The motherboard will keep all the pressure against it once it's installed. Now, before we install the motherboard, we need to talk about these little things here. These are called standoffs. And standoffs keep the back of the motherboard from coming into contact with the metal of the case. So what we need to do is we need to make sure that we have a standoff for each hole on the motherboard before we actually install it into the case. The factory pre-installed standoffs include one here, one here, one here, one here, one here, one here, and that's it. So we have 6 of them pre-installed. Now our motherboard has holes for 8 standoffs. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, along with the ones that we're missing, 7 and 8. So we need to install 2 standoffs in the case and make sure all these line up. Now, this hole here is not a hole for a standoff. You can tell because it's missing all the little metal pads around it that are meant to keep the head of the screw from coming into direct contact with the board. And there's also one here too. So I'm going to take 2 standoffs and installing them in the 2 missing spots. Now it's optional, but still highly recommended to tighten these down. You could use a pair of needle nose pliers if you don't have the proper nut driver for it, but I do happen to have one on hand. This one is a 5mm and it's still a little loose on there, but it gets the job done. Do not over tighten these because the metal they're going into is very thin and it's very easy to strip it out. Now I grabbed the motherboard by the heatsink. I think it's the best supported area because of the metal backplate underneath. Plus I don't have to touch any of these sensitive parts of the motherboard. I'm going to angle it in and line it up with the I/O shield. And now I'm going to slowly maneuver it towards the I/O shield. And now my ports have come into contact with the I/O shield and the holes are now lining up with the standoffs. Now the motherboard is ready to be fastened down to the standoffs. Now, these are the most common screws found in your computer case's screw kit. The standoffs could use either one of these types. It really depends on the size of the standoff. Usually it's these smaller ones in my experience, but if you notice it just sinks right in there, you might have to try the larger ones. Before putting this in, I'm going to put some pressure on the motherboard towards the I/O shield to make sure all the holes stay exactly where they're supposed to be. And I'm going to start with the centermost mounting point. Now all of our components are installed. We just need to start plugging things in and organizing our cables. The best place to start in any build is you take all of your cables and you run them into the back of the case, and then you start pulling ones that you need through various holes that are available in the case. And then when you're done, you hide the rest of them in the back of the case. So I'm going to start showing you that cable by cable as we wrap this build up. I'm going to take all of our power supply cables and run them through this hole right here. All right, now all our power cables are through. Up next are our front panel cables here. I'm going to be running them through this hole right here. All right, now all our cables are running into the back of the case. Starting with the most easiest one is our 3-pin fan cable. It's already nicely bundled up. There's a nice little gap underneath the fan to hide the cable. So let's plug that into our fan header located right here. Now that that's plugged in, let's see which way we could tuck this wire in. All right, our fan is plugged in and the wire is tucked underneath to keep it hidden. All right, let's tackle the power cables first. We have our 24-pin ATX power. We have our 8-pin CPU power. Once those are installed, I'm going to tuck in the rest into this hard drive cage here. We have a hole cut out here that we'll use for our 24-pin, and we have a hole cut out here that we'll use for our 8-pin CPU power. All right, starting with our ATX 24-pin. I'm going to rock that connector in back and forth. And now our CPU power. After we're done connecting all of our cables, we'll pull them back through to make them look neater, and then we'll zip tie them all up in the back of the case. But before we do that, we need to start with our front panel cables. Now for our front panel connectors, we have our USB 3.0, our USB 2.0, our front panel audio connector, and our front panel button and light connectors. USB 3.0 is located right here. Our front panel connectors are located right here for buttons and lights. Here's one of the front panel USB 2.0 ports, and we only need one. And then here's our front panel audio connector. I'll be routing 3 of those cables to the bottom since most of those pins are at the bottom of the motherboard. Our USB 3.0 cable, I'm going to put it right next to our ATX power so I could zip tie them together for a cleaner look. Starting with USB 3.0. Now our front panel button and light connectors. I'm going to put a reference on screen to the manual, but these are pretty easy and they're very similar across each motherboard. So once you do a couple of them, you just kind of memorize where they are. Most of the time, plus positive is on the left and minus is on the right, which means usually all these face downwards. And they're all very similarly laid out. So I'm just going to start off by plugging our hard drive, reset switch, and power lights in. Now that our front panel button and light connectors are in, we have our USB and audio left. These are very easy. They have distinctive pinouts that line up perfectly with the block layouts on the motherboard. Always reference the manual to know which pins go where when you're learning this. All right, everything is plugged in. Now we're going to pull all our cables through the back and tidy everything up. All right, now it's time for cable management. We're going to start at the top and move our way down. A lot of the newer cases have these little points on them that you could fasten zip ties to. Make sure you have a couple of them on hand. Sometimes they come inside the motherboard screw kit, sometimes on the power supply. But you also have to keep in mind with cable management, and you really want to figure this out first, is you have a certain amount of distance between the back plate here and the side panel that we're going to put back on. So if you want to take all of these cables together and put them in one spot, there's a good chance that it might be too thick. So you have to be careful on how you lay things out to make sure they're as flat as possible. Something like this would be much more ideal. Now I'm going to use the hard drive bay as a place to hide the rest of these wires, since we won't be using a hard drive in this build. Now if you're building this computer for someone else, you really should give them this hard drive tray. You could put it in the motherboard box with other accessories in the manual if you're building computers like that. But you want to provide this, especially since we're removing it out of the system, it would just be nice. All right, our cable management is all done. Most of our cables are hidden nicely along the back here, not really exposed through the openings in the case. If you want to go a little bit more overboard, you can put in some more zip ties, but I think this is more than enough. As you can see here, all the cable management turned out very nice on the other side. I added one zip tie here just to keep these ones together, but everything else is exactly the way we installed it. Now the system is completely ready to be powered on. I'm gonna put it on its feet now, and I'm gonna put on the back side panel on because we're still working on this and I wanna make sure everything turns on before I decide to close it all up. I also want to take a minute to show you all the ports. As you can see, the pin for the HDMI did not go in the port, which is a good sign, and everything looks perfectly lined up exactly the way it should be. If you notice any problems with this not being lined up, such as this being slightly elevated, then make sure there's nothing underneath the board preventing this from making full contact with the I/O shield. All right, we're going to plug in our power. I'm going to make sure the power switch is in the off position, and it is. I'm going to plug in my HDMI video. And I'm going to be plugging in the wireless USB receiver. I'm going to flip the switch on. All right, our system booted up fully. I'm looking at the reboot and select proper boot device screen. But before we wrap up, you could take a look at your top buttons here. Make sure your power light is on. You can monitor the hard drive light as we start installing an operating system to make sure that works properly. All right, now for our next video, we're going to go into the BIOS and prep the system for a Windows 10 installation. Afterwards, we're going to install the Windows 10 operating system. I'll walk you through that full procedure. We're going to test the system for stability, and I'm going to show you a couple tips and tricks on customizing Windows 10 to make it run a little bit more efficient. Now, if you like this video, please hit the like button, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.